tightly bound to a wooden stake and burned alive until his flesh charred black, scholar Robert Barnes suffered a gruesome execution by fire, while King Henry VIII celebrated a lavish new royal wedding. This unprecedented demonstration of state power was staged to assert sovereign dominance, sending Barnes to the pyre not for high treason, but for the stark reality of brokering a marriage with a bride the king found unappealing. Despite being a capable diplomat who successfully secured the crucial political alliance with Anne of Cleves, historical records note that the monarch's immediate repulsion to the new queen's appearance prompted him to execute the principal architects of the marriage treaty, systematically turning a dedicated envoy into a convenient political scapegoat to vent his profound royal frustration. The early 16th century was a rigid era in Europe, dominated by strict religious orthodoxies. The Catholic Church held unprecedented authority over spiritual life, intellectual pursuits, and political wealth across the continent. Theological disagreements were not tolerated during this time, and publicly questioning the ecclesiastical hierarchy carried severe legal consequences. Defiance frequently led to formal charges of heresy, creating an unforgiving environment that systematically shaped the period's religious landscape. Robert Barnes was born around 1495 in King's Lynn, Norfolk. Unlike isolated English villages, King's Lynn was a busy seaport directly connected to the Hanseatic League. This powerful German merchant network brought constant international trade in foreign languages to the eastern coast. Young Barnes grew up watching ships arrive from Bremen and Hamburg, bringing timber, wool, and news from mainland Europe. This early exposure to continental politics and commerce significantly influenced his worldview. Raised in this dynamic environment, Barnes decided to enter monastic life. He joined the Austin Friars, an Augustinian order known for its vows of poverty and strict academic discipline. These friars maintained a relentless focus on intense theological study and rigorous debate. Their core teachings strongly emphasized the grace of God alongside the inherent flaws of human nature. This specific theological foundation prepared Barnes's mind for the religious reformations approaching England. Around 1514, Barnes's career path took a significant turn. His superiors within the Augustinian order recognized his exceptional intellectual and rhetorical abilities. Realizing he needed more advanced training than local provincial libraries or early Cambridge could offer, they decided to send him abroad. Barnes was dispatched across the English Channel to study at the prestigious University of Louvain in modern-day Belgium. This renowned institution offered the high-level academic challenges he required. At this time, Louvain was the primary epicenter of intellectual progress in Northern Europe. It was significantly influenced by the great Dutch humanist thinker Desiderius Erasmus. To understand Barnes's transformation, one must understand humanism. It was not a secular movement as we might define the word today. It was a profoundly religious, revolutionary academic methodology. Humanism taught scholars to bypass the centuries of cluttered, dense, and often mistranslated medieval scholastic commentary. The rallying cry of the humanists was ad fonte, to the sources. At Louvain, Barnes was plunged into a grueling academic crucible. He learned ancient Greek and refined his classical Latin. He learned how to strip away the accumulated dogmas of the medieval church and read the Bible and the early church fathers in their purest, original forms. He was taught to question the Latin Vulgate translation that the church relied upon, analyzing the original Greek texts to discover profound shifts in meaning. This was dangerous, intoxicating knowledge. It was a time of immense geopolitical and social flux. Much like the sudden tectonic shifts that periodically shatter continental political alliances, forcing rival nations to frantically realign their borders and economic treaties overnight, the 16th century European powers were experiencing their own seismic ideological upheavals that continuously threatened to topple monarchies and completely rewrite the established laws of state authority. The atmosphere in Louvain was charged with the prospect of reforming an entrenched society from the top down. Armed with this explosive new perspective, Robert Barnes returned to the misty fens of Cambridge in 1523. He returned not just as a scholar, but as a newly minted Doctor of Divinity and the prior of the Augustinian monastery at Cambridge. Barnes did not quietly settle into his prestigious new role. He was a man possessed by the humanist fire. He immediately gutted the old stale scholastic curriculum that had dominated the university for centuries. He threw out the repetitive commentaries of Duns Scotus and Thomas Aquinas. In their place, he introduced the vibrant, elegant classical works of Terence, Plautus, and Cicero. He began lecturing on the epistles of St. Paul in a way that Cambridge had never heard before, focusing on the raw, unvarnished text rather than centuries of papal interpretation. He was turning his monastery into a powerhouse of modern thought, attracting the brightest, most ambitious young minds in the university. But modern thought in the 1520s was rapidly evolving into a deadly game. Over in the German states, an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther had struck a match that was burning the medieval world to the ground. Luther's contraband writings, his tracts condemning the sale of indulgences, his attacks on papal authority, his radical redefinitions of the sacraments, were being smuggled into the eastern ports of England, hidden in bales of cloth and barrels of grain by the very Hanseatic merchants Barnes had grown up observing. Barnes quickly found himself at the gravitational center of a covert, radical group of young Cambridge intellectuals. They gathered in secret at a tavern called the White Horse Inn. Because they debated Luther's illegal heretical ideas so obsessively, conservative authorities at the university mockingly dubbed the tavern Little Germany. In the smoky, dimly lit back rooms of the White Horse, Barnes sat alongside men whose names would soon be written in blood and fire across English history: Thomas Cranmer, Hugh Latimer, Miles Coverdale, and Thomas Bilney. Robert Barnes was a brilliant humanist, but he was still fundamentally an Orthodox Catholic. He wanted to clean up the church, not tear it down. His true spiritual transformation, the shift that would eventually lead him to the stake, was meticulously, quietly forged by Thomas Bilney. Bilney was a gentle, physically frail, and unassuming scholar, known affectionately as Little Bilney. But beneath his fragile exterior, he possessed a rod of iron in his spine and a blazing evangelical fervor. Through intense private conversations pacing the grounds of Cambridge, Bilney systematically dismantled Barnes's deeply held medieval worldview. Bilney introduced Barnes to the theological concept of sola fide, justification by faith alone. Bilney systematically argued his theological position, utilizing the very Pauline epistles Barnes was currently lecturing on. He posited that humanity remained fundamentally corrupted by original sin. Consequently, he maintained that no volume of charitable works, physical pilgrimages, purchased indulgences, or priestly absolutions could adequately bridge the spiritual divide separating mankind from a holy God. Salvation, Bilney convinced Barnes, was an unearned gift from God, received through faith in the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ. It was a direct transaction between a human being and their Creator, effectively bypassing the massive, wealthy, and politically entrenched machinery of the Roman Catholic Church. For Barnes, accepting this theology was not just a minor shift in academic belief. It was a psychological earthquake. It was a realization that the entire structure of his world, the wealth of the monasteries, the terrifying power of the bishops, the complex economy of salvation that the church sold to terrified peasants, was built on a lucrative, soul-destroying lie. Once a man with Barnes's fiery temperament and rhetorical genius realized this, silence was no longer an option. This newfound burning conviction led to his first fatal collision with the Tudor machine. It happened on a freezing Christmas Eve in 1525. Barnes was invited to preach at the church of St. Edward King and Martyr in the center of Cambridge. The church was packed to the rafters with scholars, townspeople, and university spies. Given the sacred holiday, the congregation expected a traditional, safe, and comforting message about the birth of the Savior. Instead, Robert Barnes climbed into the pulpit and effectively ended his life as a quiet, safe academic. He launched a direct, blistering, and specific verbal assault on the hierarchy of the English church. He did not aim low. He aimed at the absolute pinnacle of power, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was the Lord Chancellor of England, the Archbishop of York, and a papal legate. Next to King Henry VIII himself, Wolsey was the most powerful, wealthy, and ruthless man in the nation. Wolsey was the embodiment of the opulent, corrupt, medieval church. He traveled with a retinue of hundreds, dressed in dripping crimson silk, surrounded by symbols of absolute earthly power. Standing in the pulpit, Barnes starkly contrasted the poverty and humility of Jesus Christ, born in a filthy manger, with Wolsey's immense wealth. He openly mocked the cardinal's silver pillars. He derided the cardinal's shoes, which were famously encrusted with pearls and gold. He attacked the velvet cushions Wolsey knelt upon and the ceremonial golden poleaxes carried before him in the streets of London. Barnes demanded to know how a man claiming to be a successor of the impoverished apostles could hoard such wealth while the poor of England starved in the streets. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge was in the audience. The Tudor regime did not view this sermon as a spirited theological critique or a call for institutional reform. In the eyes of the crown, this was treasonous subversion. It was an attack on the very hierarchy and stability of the state itself. By attacking Wolsey, Barnes was attacking the king's chosen instrument of governance. Within weeks, the heavy hand of the Tudor state came crashing down on the Cambridge prior. State agents arrived at the university. Barnes's rooms were thoroughly searched for contraband Lutheran texts. He was swiftly arrested, dragged under armed guard to London, and thrown into the terrifying, relentless machinery of Tudor interrogation. The brilliant scholar of Louvain, the fiery preacher of the White Horse Inn, was about to face the unyielding wrath of the men who ruled England. The scent of burning wood was already in the air. Robert Barnes was dragged from the intellectual sanctuary of Cambridge and thrust directly into the brutal architecture of Tudor justice. He was transported under armed guard to London and brought before the highest authorities of the realm at Westminster Palace. He was no longer a respected academic debating theology in a tavern. He was a political prisoner facing the apex of English power. The interrogation was not a debate. It was a calculated exercise in psychological dismantling. Barnes was brought face to face with Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the very man he had so recklessly mocked just weeks prior. Wolsey did not operate alone. He was flanked by Bishop John Fisher of Rochester, one of the most formidable, conservative, and intellectually ruthless Catholic theologians in Europe. Fisher despised the Lutheran contagion and viewed Barnes as a dangerous, infected vector. The state apparatus presented Barnes with a meticulously drafted document containing 25 devastating charges of heresy. These charges were carefully extracted from his Christmas Eve sermon. They did not merely accuse him of insulting the cardinal. The Tudor legal team twisted his critiques of clerical wealth into formal, undeniable attacks on the sacramental structure of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. The strategy of the interrogation was classic Tudor coercion. They did not immediately physically torture him. They applied suffocating psychological pressure. Wolsey and Fisher presented Barnes with a blunt ultimatum. The legal parameters were clear. He could recant his sermon, publicly confess to heresy, and submit to the mercy of the Church. Or he could stand by his humanist convictions, defend his words, and be immediately handed over to the secular authorities. The punishment for unrepentant heresy was absolute. He would be tied to a wooden stake at Smithfield and burned alive. History often demands flawless martyrs, men and women who stare into the flames with unwavering resolve and march joyfully to their deaths. The reality of human psychology is rarely so pristine. Robert Barnes was a brilliant scholar, but he was a human being facing an exceptionally agonizing death. He was locked in a cold cell, isolated from his Cambridge allies, and crushed under the sheer terrifying weight of the Tudor state machinery. His friends and fellow academics, terrified for his life and their own, smuggled messages to him, desperately pleading with him to submit. They argued that a dead reformer could achieve nothing, but a living scholar might fight another day. The psychological pressure finally fractured his resolve. The imminent psychological reality of execution by fire ultimately overwhelmed his long-standing ideological commitments to the reformist movement. Barnes broke. He agreed to the state's terms. He signed a formal abjuration, a legally binding document in which he confessed to spreading vile heresies, retracted his attacks on the cardinal, and begged for the forgiveness of the Church. He surrendered his intellectual integrity to save his physical body, but the Tudor regime did not accept a quiet, paper surrender. They required a massive, visible spectacle to humiliate the dissident, terrorize his followers, and publicly reassert the dominance of the state hierarchy. On Sunday, February 11, 1526, the Crown orchestrated one of the most elaborate pieces of state theater of the decade. The location was St. Paul's Cross in London, the premier open-air pulpit in the nation, capable of holding thousands of spectators. The visual staging was designed to physically manifest the crushing power of the church. Cardinal Wolsey arrived in a display of calculated opulence. He sat upon a massive elevated scaffold, draped in crimson silk, surrounded by 36 bishops, abbots, and high-ranking clerics. It was a visual counterattack against Barnes's sermon on poverty. Wolsey was demonstrating that the wealth of the church was untouchable. Robert Barnes, the proud doctor of divinity, was led into the dirt before the massive mocking crowd. He was stripped of his academic robes and his dignity. He was forced to kneel in the winter mud alongside several Hanseatic merchants who had been caught smuggling Lutheran books. The state forced Barnes to carry a heavy, rough bundle of wooden sticks, a faggot, on his shoulder. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a physical representation of the firewood that would have been used to roast him alive had he not submitted. It was the mark of a broken heretic. Bishop John Fisher delivered a blistering 2-hour sermon denouncing Martin Luther and explicitly humiliating Barnes. Following the sermon, Barnes was forced to stand in, with his own hands, throw the smuggled contraband books of the Reformation into a blazing bonfire constructed at the base of the cross. He was publicly castrated as an intellectual force. The state had successfully demonstrated that even the brightest minds of Cambridge could be brought to their knees and made to burn their own beliefs. Following the public penance, Barnes was not set free. As a confessed heretic, he was legally dead in the eyes of his profession. He was stripped of his position as prior, banned from preaching, and placed under strict, indefinite house arrest. He was transferred between the Austin Friars in London and the monastery in Northampton, effectively buried alive in the monastic system. For 2 years, Barnes lived as a ghost. He was a humiliated, heavily monitored prisoner, but the state misunderstood the nature of the man they had broken. They assumed his public humiliation had extinguished his radicalism. They were wrong. The trauma of his capitulation did not destroy his faith, it radicalized it. While under house arrest, Barnes secretly utilized his remaining underground connections. He engaged in highly illegal subversive activities. He began acquiring and quietly distributing copies of William Tyndale's newly printed English translation of the New Testament. In the late 1520s, possessing an English Bible was a capital offense. By 1528, the Tudor intelligence network began closing in on the distribution ring. Barnes realized that his illegal activities were about to be exposed. As a relapsed heretic, a man who had already confessed and was now caught repeating the offense, there would be no second trial, no second public penance. The law mandated immediate execution by fire. Knowing his life hung by a fraying thread, Barnes executed a calculated, desperate operational maneuver. He managed to slip his guards and walk to the muddy banks of the River Thames. He stripped off his monastic robes and left them piled on the shoreline. Beside his clothes, he left a carefully forged suicide note. He wrote that the crushing guilt of his heresies and the despair of his imprisonment had driven him to drown himself in the dark waters of the river. It was a brilliant piece of misdirection. While the English authorities dragged the freezing river for his corpse, Barnes, terrified and disguised in the rough clothing of a common laborer, smuggled himself onto a merchant ship. He utilized the very Hanseatic trade networks he had grown up observing in King's Lynn. The ship sailed east, carrying the phantom of Robert Barnes away from the executioners of London. He disembarked in Antwerp, disappearing into the chaotic, shifting landscape of continental Europe. Barnes did not remain in the commercial hubs of the Low Countries. He traveled directly into the epicenter of the religious revolution. He walked to Wittenberg, Germany. Wittenberg was the fortress of the Reformation. It was the home of Martin Luther. For a fugitive English priest, it was the safest place on earth, protected by the military might of the Elector of Saxony, who had openly defied the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. To protect his identity from Tudor assassins and imperial spies, Barnes adopted a new alias, Antonius Angelus, the English Anthony. In Wittenberg, Barnes finally found the intellectual and spiritual home he has been searching for. He was welcomed not as a broken heretic, but as a courageous exile. He moved into the house of Johannes Bugenhagen, one of the premier theologians of the movement. He formed close, genuine, and influential friendships with Martin Luther and the brilliant scholar Philip Melanchthon. Surrounded by the most formidable minds of the Reformation, his shattered confidence returned. He was no longer a prisoner, he was a peer. He engaged in high-level theological drafting, assisting the German reformers in their diplomatic and religious strategies. In 1530, Barnes completed his intellectual redemption. Operating under his alias, he published a massive, sophisticated theological masterpiece in Latin, titled Sententiae ex doctoribus collectae, sentences collected from the doctors. This book was not a crude, angry pamphlet. It was a rigorous, brilliant piece of scholarship. Barnes meticulously utilized the writings of the early, universally respected church fathers, Augustine, Jerome, and Ambrose, to definitively prove that Protestant doctrine was not a wild, new heresy. He argued flawlessly that justification by faith alone was the original, pure, and uncorrupted theology of the ancient Christian faith, and that the modern Catholic Church was the true deviation. The publication of this book transformed Antonius Angelus into an international theological superstar. It was read across Europe. It proved that the English exile was one of the most capable defenders of the Protestant cause. But the book also achieved something far more dangerous. It crossed the English Channel. It was read in the private chambers of Whitehall Palace. It put the exiled, supposedly dead Robert Barnes directly onto the radar of a man who was systematically redesigning the entire political architecture of England. Thomas Cromwell was watching, and Cromwell had found a use for the phantom. By 1531, the political geometry of England was undergoing a violent, unprecedented restructuring. King Henry VIII was engulfed in a crisis entirely of his own making. Desperate for a legitimate male heir to secure the fragile Tudor dynasty, he required a divorce from his aging Spanish wife, Catherine of Aragon, so he could marry the younger Anne Boleyn. When Pope Clement VII, effectively a political prisoner of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, refused to grant the annulment, Henry VIII executed a catastrophic geopolitical maneuver. He severed England from the 1,000-year authority of the Roman Catholic Church. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This act of staggering hubris left England isolated. The Tudor state was staring down the barrel of a combined holy invasion from the massive Catholic superpowers of France and the Holy Roman Empire. To survive this self-inflicted siege, the king required a brilliant, ruthless manager. He found him in Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell, newly appointed to the king's inner circle, was a master pragmatist. He looked at the map of Europe and realized that if England was alienated from the Catholic South, it desperately needed allies in the Protestant North. He needed a military and diplomatic alliance with the German Protestant princes. But Cromwell faced a massive logistical hurdle. The German theologians, led by Martin Luther, distrusted the English king. Henry VIII had, just a decade prior, authored a book viciously attacking Luther and defending the Pope. Cromwell needed an envoy who possessed the unshakable trust of the German reformers. Cromwell's intelligence network located Robert Barnes in Wittenberg. A deal was struck. In 1531, King Henry VIII granted official safe conduct to the very man he had previously forced to carry a faggot of wood at St. Paul's Cross. Barnes returned to England, but he was required to pay a heavy ideological toll for his re-entry. He published a tract titled A Supplication unto the most gracious Prince King Henry VIII. In it, Barnes deployed his formidable theological intellect to defend Henry's royal supremacy. He argued, citing scripture, that the king's absolute power over both state and church came directly from God, and that subjects owed the monarch absolute obedience. This marks the great quiet tragedy of Robert Barnes's middle years. A man of genuine, fiery religious conviction was hollowed out and repurposed as a political tool. He believed he was using the king to advance the Protestant Reformation in England. In reality, the king and Cromwell were using him to secure the borders of the Tudor state. For the next 8 years, Robert Barnes was utilized as Cromwell's primary diplomatic asset in Northern Europe. He was constantly dispatched across the English Channel, bouncing between the paranoid, volatile court in London and the rigid, fiercely principled theological centers of Germany. Cromwell burdened Barnes with impossible, fundamentally contradictory orders. First, Barnes was ordered to build a binding military alliance with the Schmalkaldic League, the defensive confederation of Protestant German princes. Second, he was to function as a Tudor spy, funneling continental state secrets back to London. Third, and most absurdly, he was ordered to convince the German theologians, specifically Martin Luther, to officially and legally bless King Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Barnes attempted to execute these orders, but he was negotiating on a fault line. The German reformers were men of rigid, uncompromising scripture. They despised King Henry's divorce. Martin Luther famously snapped that the English king's marital problems were a disgrace, suggesting that Henry should simply take 2 wives at once, committing bigamy, rather than warp, twist, and violate Scripture just to justify his lust for Anne Boleyn. Furthermore, the Germans were suspicious of Henry's brand of religion. Henry VIII had no interest in the true theological Reformation. He still maintained belief in Catholic doctrine. He simply wanted Catholicism without the Pope. Barnes was caught in the crushing middle. In Germany, he had to aggressively defend a king whose personal life offended the reformers. In England, he had to advocate for German theological reforms to a king who actively burned Protestants. Cromwell treated Barnes like a political tap. He turned Barnes's preaching on when he needed to court the Germans, and violently shut him down with threats of the Tower of London when Henry felt the need to appease his conservative Catholic nobles at home. Barnes was walking a diplomatic tightrope over an active volcano, and the geopolitical temperature was about to spike. The pressure cooker exploded in the summer of 1538. The geopolitical nightmare that Thomas Cromwell had spent a decade trying to prevent finally materialized. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles I and the French King Francis III met at Nice. Brokered by the Pope, the two Catholic superpowers signed a 10-year truce. They were no longer fighting each other. They turned their unified, hostile gaze toward England. Simultaneously, Pope Paul III finally issued the delayed bull of excommunication against King Henry VIII. This was not merely a spiritual condemnation, it was a devastating political weapon. The bull officially deposed Henry, absolved all English subjects of their loyalty to the crown, and explicitly called upon the Catholic monarchs of Europe to launch a holy crusade to wipe the Tudor state off the map. England plunged into suffocating paranoia. The threat of invasion was real and imminent. Coastal fortresses were commissioned and built at breakneck speed along the southern shores. The militia was mustered. Martial law was effectively declared. England was completely surrounded, isolated, and lacked a single powerful ally on the continent. To shatter this siege, Thomas Cromwell engineered his most desperate, high-stakes gamble. He could not secure an alliance with the major Catholic powers, and the radical German princes of the Schmalkaldic League were demanding too many theological concessions from the stubborn English king. Cromwell needed a strategic middle ground. He looked at the map of Europe and found the Duchy of Cleves. The Duchy of Cleves, located in the modern-day Rhineland, was a geopolitical goldmine for the Tudor state in 1539. Strategically, Cleves sat geographically right across the emperor's path to the sea. An alliance with Cleves would threaten the emperor's supply lines and force him to divert troops away from an invasion of England. Politically, the Duke of Cleves, William the Rich, harbored a deep, simmering hatred for the emperor over a territorial dispute regarding the neighboring Duchy of Guelders. Theologically, Cleves was perfectly positioned. They practiced a moderate Erasmian form of Protestantism. They had rejected papal authority, but had not embraced the radical, strict doctrines of Martin Luther. Cromwell calculated that this moderate stance would appease the Protestant factions in Europe while remaining palatable to the increasingly conservative Catholic-leaning Henry VIII. To cement this vital nation-saving alliance, Cromwell proposed a royal marriage. King Henry VIII, recently widowed following the death of his third wife, Jane Seymour, would marry the Duke's eldest sister, Anne of Cleves. Robert Barnes was immediately dispatched to Germany. He was the point man, the primary architect tasked with negotiating the deal of the century. But Barnes was negotiating on a trapdoor. While Barnes was in Germany promising the Duke of Cleves a unified, reform-minded alliance with England, King Henry VIII violently pulled the rug out from under his own diplomats. In the spring of 1539, Henry forced the Act of 6 Articles through the English Parliament. The 6 Articles were a brutal, devastating piece of reactionary legislation. Often referred to by Protestants as the whip with 6 strings, the act forcefully reasserted core Orthodox Catholic doctrines in England. It confirmed transubstantiation, clerical celibacy, and the necessity of auricular confession. Crucially, the act mandated the horrific death by burning for anyone who dared to deny these Catholic doctrines. When news of the 6 Articles reached Germany, the Protestant princes and the Duke of Cleves were furious and disgusted. They realized the English king was executing men who believed exactly what the Germans believed. To save the vital military alliance that Cromwell insisted was the only thing preventing a Catholic invasion of England, Robert Barnes and the English delegation had to employ a desperate strategy of separated diplomacy. Barnes had to look the Duke of Cleves in the eye and lie. He had to claim that the brutal Act of 6 Articles was merely a temporary, pragmatic political maneuver designed to keep the rebellious, conservative English peasants quiet. He had to convince the Germans to sign a military pact while entirely ignoring the massive, bloody religious chasm that was actively opening between the two nations. To finalize this desperate contract of survival, the entire English delegation, orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell, committed a fatal, unforgivable error. They recognized that King Henry VIII was vain, superficial, and opposed to the marriage on a personal level. To force the king's hand, the diplomats lied to their own sovereign. They heavily exaggerated the beauty, the grace, and the sophistication of Anne of Cleves in their dispatches back to London. They commissioned the famous court painter, Hans Holbein the Younger, to travel to Cleves and paint her portrait. Holbein, understanding the political assignment, produced a notoriously flattering, idealized painting that minimized her flaws and maximized her appeal. Most dangerously of all, the delegation brushed past a highly toxic legal loophole. In 1527, when Anne of Cleves was a child, a pre-contract of marriage had been arranged between her and the Duke of Lorraine. While the Cleves diplomats assured the English that the contract had been formally broken, the documentary proof was missing. In the hyper-legalistic, paranoid world of Tudor royal marriages, ignoring a pre-contract was equivalent to carrying a lit torch into a powder magazine. Driven by the terror of a French imperial invasion, Cromwell and Barnes pushed the deal through. The marriage treaty was officially signed on October 4, 1539. They had secured the military shield that England desperately needed, but they had built it on a foundation of fragile deception. They had promised a conservative king a beautiful, sophisticated bride, and they had promised a Protestant duke a reform-minded king. The collision between the Tudor king's massive ego and the harsh reality of the German bride was unavoidable. The countdown to disaster had begun, and Robert Barnes was standing precisely at ground zero. The diplomatic triumph orchestrated by Robert Barnes and Thomas Cromwell in Germany ignored a massive, insurmountable cultural reality. Anne of Cleves was not a Tudor courtier. She had not been raised in the glittering, hypersexualized, politically fluid courts of France or England. She was raised in the incredibly strict, suffocatingly conservative environment of the German provincial nobility. She wore heavy, dark, body-concealing garments that were out of fashion in London. She spoke only German. She did not know how to sing, she did not know how to play the lute, and she possessed zero comprehension of the elaborate, highly ritualized game of courtly love that defined King Henry's court. On January 1st, 1540, the geopolitical abstraction became a physical reality. The collision occurred. Anne had endured a grueling sea voyage and was resting at the Bishop's Palace in Rochester before her formal entry into London. King Henry VIII, now 48 years old, massively overweight and suffering from foul-smelling, painful ulcers on his legs, still operated under a profound psychological delusion. He believed he was a dashing, irresistible romantic knight. Discarding all diplomatic protocol, Henry dressed in a heavy cloak, disguised himself and a few companions, and barged unannounced into Anne's private chambers. In his narcissistic fantasy, he believed that the power of true love would allow his new bride to instantly recognize the majestic king beneath the humble disguise. Anne was standing at a window, watching a brutal bull-baiting exhibition in the courtyard below. Suddenly, a strange, heavy, breathless man grabbed her from behind and attempted to embrace and kiss her. Revolted, alarmed, and confused by this aggressive stranger, Anne pushed him away. She looked at him with cold indifference, shrugged in disgust, and turned her back to the most powerful, dangerous man in England to continue watching the courtyard. In those few seconds of silence, Henry VIII suffered a significant psychological crisis. This encounter constituted a profound, irrecoverable blow to the monarch's carefully constructed self-image and regal authority. His lifelong perception of supreme masculinity and royal magnetism was shattered instantly by a single look of indifference from a foreign bride. Enraged, humiliated, and repulsed that his fantasy had failed, Henry stormed out of the room. He put on his royal velvet robes and returned to formally introduce himself, but the psychological damage was permanent. Leaving Rochester, Henry spat the words that would seal the doom of both Thomas Cromwell and Robert Barnes. Speaking to his courtiers, he delivered his absolute devastating verdict on the bride they had procured for him. "I like her not." Unable to process the reality that he had been rejected, King Henry's ego enacted a vicious, immediate defense mechanism. He launched a brutal, pathetic smear campaign against Anne of Cleves. He attacked her body to protect his own pride. He complained to his courtiers that she was loose, that her breasts were slack, and that she smelled foul. He famously likened her to a Flanders mare. He blamed his own inability to perform sexually on her physical repulsiveness. It was a masterclass in victim blaming by a tyrant, desperate to cover his own profound humiliation. Henry furiously ordered Thomas Cromwell to cancel the wedding. He demanded that his lawyers utilize the old pre-contract with the Duke of Lorraine to invalidate the treaty. But the Cleves ambassadors held their ground. They refused to back down, recognizing the king's panic for what it was. Cromwell had to deliver the terrifying truth to his sovereign. The diplomatic trap was closed. If Henry canceled this wedding, he would permanently insult the German princes. He would drive the Duchy of Cleves directly into the arms of the Holy Roman Emperor, and England would face the combined invasion force they had spent a year trying to prevent. Cornered, furious, and humiliated, Henry was forced to submit to his own foreign policy. He married Anne of Cleves on January 6, 1540. He never consummated the marriage. For a king obsessed with producing a spare male heir, this was a political disaster. To ensure the blame rested entirely on his wife and not on his own aging biology, Henry loudly broadcasted his sexual failure to the entire court. He complained to his doctors and his gentlemen of the privy chamber that he had felt her belly and breasts and determined she was no maid. The marriage was a hollow, toxic shell, and the king was actively looking for a scapegoat. By the early spring of 1540, the geopolitical landscape violently shifted again. In 16th century Europe, alliances were made of sand. The terrifying truce between the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and the French king Francis I began to fracture. They went back to war over control of the Duchy of Milan. The threat of a unified pan-Catholic invasion of England evaporated overnight. For Thomas Cromwell and Robert Barnes, this was the worst possible news. The Cleves alliance, which had cost King Henry his dignity and his sexual pride, was suddenly utterly worthless. The strategic shield was no longer needed, which meant the architects of the shield were expendable. The conservative Catholic faction at the English court smelled blood in the water. This faction was led by two of the most ruthless, capable political operators in the realm, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester. Norfolk and Gardiner despised Thomas Cromwell. They viewed him as a low-born, heretical upstart who had stolen the power that rightly belonged to the ancient nobility and the Orthodox clergy. They knew Henry was desperate for a way out of his marriage, and they knew he was looking for someone to punish. They aimed their political artillery right at Cromwell. But to destroy the heavily entrenched chief minister, they first needed to dismantle his intelligence network and his diplomatic agents. They needed to prove that Cromwell was secretly fostering radical heresy within the borders of England. To achieve this, they locked their sights on his most visible, vocal, and controversial agent, Robert Barnes. Bishop Stephen Gardiner was a master of theological warfare. He knew Robert Barnes intimately. He understood Barnes's brilliant academic mind, but more importantly, he understood Barnes's psychological flaws. Barnes was hot-headed. He was fiercely proud of his theological education. He was fundamentally unable to back down from an intellectual fight. Gardiner laid a brilliant, highly public trap. In February 1540, during the solemn season of Lent, Bishop Gardiner secured the premier preaching slot at St. Paul's Cross in London. Standing before a massive crowd of citizens, nobles, and Tudor spies, Gardiner delivered a meticulously crafted sermon. He did not attack Barnes by name. Instead, he aggressively attacked the core Protestant doctrine that Barnes had spent his life defending: justification by faith alone. Gardiner utilized his sharp intellect to defend the Orthodox Catholic position, arguing that good works and the sacraments of the Church were necessary for salvation. He framed the Lutheran doctrine as a dangerous, chaotic heresy that encouraged sin and rebellion against the state. Gardiner cast the bait directly into the water. He knew that Robert Barnes, currently residing in London, would not be able to tolerate a public assault on his core convictions. 2 weeks later, the trap snapped shut. Robert Barnes stepped up to the exact same pulpit at St. Paul's Cross. He had been officially assigned the preaching rotation, likely orchestrated by Cromwell's enemies. Instead of delivering a standard Lenten sermon, Barnes allowed his theological pride and his temper to override his political survival instincts. He launched a reckless, highly personal, and devastating counterattack against the Bishop of Winchester. Barnes dismantled Gardiner's theology piece by piece, but he did not stop at academic debate. He publicly mocked the bishop. Playing on Gardiner's name, Barnes called him a gardener who cultivated nothing but theological weeds and toxic plants. He compared their high-level theological debate to a petty, vicious cockfight, stripping the bishop of his ecclesiastical dignity in front of the London mob. It was a brilliant rhetorical performance. It was also an act of staggering political suicide. Barnes had just publicly and spectacularly violated the King's Act of 6 Articles. He had openly preached Protestant doctrine and mocked a senior conservative bishop in the capital city. Bishop Gardiner immediately went to King Henry VIII. He reported the sermon, framing Barnes as a radical heretic and a dangerous subversive who was inciting riots in London. Henry VIII was thrilled. The king finally had a legal and theological excuse to arrest one of the men responsible for the humiliating disaster of the German bride. Furthermore, prosecuting Barnes allowed Henry to publicly demonstrate to Europe that despite his break from Rome, he was still a fierce Orthodox defender of the Catholic faith against Lutheran heresy. The king personally intervened. He did not hand Barnes over to the standard ecclesiastical courts. Henry ordered Barnes dragged to Hampton Court Palace to face a private royal tribunal. Standing before the massive, enraged king, Barnes found himself right back where he had been in 1526 with Cardinal Wolsey. Henry relentlessly badgered, threatened, and cornered the scholar. The king deployed his own formidable theological training to trap Barnes in logical contradictions regarding the 6 Articles. Faced with the absolute terrifying wrath of the sovereign, Barnes's resolve fractured for a second time. To save his life, he capitulated. He fell to his knees and formally submitted to the king's theology. He signed a comprehensive confession, retracting his attacks on Gardiner and disavowing his Protestant beliefs. Henry VIII, desiring a total public humiliation, ordered Barnes to deliver a groveling state-mandated apology at the upcoming Spittle sermons during Easter week. Barnes was to stand before the crowds, read his confession, and beg Bishop Gardiner for forgiveness. The Tudor state believed they had broken the scholar once again. They believed he would perform his penance and fade into the shadows, providing the necessary ammunition to begin the takedown of Thomas Cromwell. But the state had miscalculated. Robert Barnes had reached the absolute limit of his moral compromises. He was preparing to draw his final fatal line in the sand. By the summer of 1540, Robert Barnes was locked deep within the Tower of London. Outside his cell walls, the political architecture of England was violently collapsing and rebuilding itself. In June, King Henry VIII legally annulled his unconsummated, humiliating marriage to Anne of Cleves. On June 10th, the architect of that marriage, Thomas Cromwell, was suddenly arrested in the middle of a Privy Council meeting. Cromwell was stripped of his titles, condemned as a traitor and a heretic, and beheaded on Tower Hill a month later. With his political patron dead and the German alliance formally abandoned, Robert Barnes was completely exposed. But Henry VIII faced a distinct logistical problem regarding the scholar's execution. The standard procedure for executing a high-profile heretic involved a public ecclesiastical trial, but a trial required testimony. It required the accused to speak in an open court, with scribes recording every word. Henry VIII knew that Barnes was one of the most brilliant, persuasive, and fearless orators in Europe. If the state granted Barnes a public trial, Barnes would possess a platform. He would have the opportunity to expose the humiliating, pathetic realities of the Cleves diplomatic negotiations to the entire world. He could publicly detail the king's broken promises to the German princes. He could expose the political hypocrisy of the Tudor court. King Henry VIII could not risk the exposure. To solve this, the king reached for the most cowardly dictatorial legal instrument in English history, the Act of Attainder. The Act of Attainder was a law passed by Parliament that declared a man guilty by legislative decree. It bypassed the judicial system entirely. There was no trial. The state presented no evidence. There were no witnesses to cross-examine. Most importantly, it denied the accused the right to speak a single word in his own defense. The psychological nuance of this specific attainder is chilling. Thomas Cromwell was executed for treason, but Robert Barnes was executed for heresy. By specifically labeling Barnes a heretic, Henry VIII masked his own petty, vindictive revenge for a botched marriage behind the holy, righteous veil of defending the Catholic faith. It allowed Henry to signal to the Catholic powers of Europe that his hands were clean of Protestant corruption, using the ashes of Robert Barnes as his geopolitical proof. The climax of this geopolitical disaster occurred on July 30th, 1540. The absolute ruthlessness and calculated political pragmatism inherent in the Tudor administrative apparatus were unequivocally demonstrated during the specific events of that execution morning. History requires us to look at a split screen. As Robert Barnes was being dragged across the unforgiving cobblestones toward the Smithfield fires, King Henry VIII was miles away at Oatlands Palace in Surrey. The monarch was still deeply immersed in the lavish wedding festivities with his fifth wife, the Catholic teenager Catherine Howard, having commenced the celebrations just 48 hours prior. The stark contrast between the luxury of the aging king's wedding and the heat of the martyr's pyre illustrates the chilling indifference of sovereign power. The state was celebrating a royal honeymoon while simultaneously butchering its most loyal diplomats. Early that morning, 6 men were brought out of the Tower of London. They were strapped flat onto their backs on rough wooden hurdles, heavy sleds with no wheels. The king's guards employed a deeply sadistic, highly calculated matching algorithm for the agonizing 3-mile drag through the rocky, filth-covered streets of London to the execution grounds at Smithfield. On each hurdle, the state tied one Protestant reformer back to back with one Orthodox Catholic priest. Robert Barnes was strapped tightly against Thomas Abel. Abel was a fiercely loyal, brilliant Catholic priest who had spent years defending the validity of Henry's first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Abel despised Protestant theology. This pairing was not a logistical accident. It was deliberate, engineered psychological warfare. It was designed to force men who hated each other over the eternal fate of their souls to share their final agonizing journey in the mud together. The message Henry VIII was broadcasting to the massive crowds lining the streets was brutal and absolute. Whether you look to Rome or to Germany, whether you are Catholic or Protestant, in England, you are nothing but meat to be crushed if you defy the supremacy of the king. Arriving at the execution grounds of Smithfield, the victims found that the state had constructed 2 entirely different machines of death to physically demonstrate Henry's new, lethal middle way of religion. The 3 Catholics, Thomas Abel, Edward Powell, and Richard Featherston, were condemned under the Treason Act for refusing to accept the king as the supreme head of the church. They were subjected to the absolute horror of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. They were pushed off the scaffold with a short drop, a method explicitly designed to strangle them slowly without breaking their necks. They were cut down while still fully conscious, gasping for air, and strapped to heavy wooden tables. The executioners sliced open their abdomens, pulled out their intestines, and threw their vital organs into a boiling cauldron of pitch right before their dying eyes, before finally hacking their bodies into 4 pieces. The 3 Protestants, Robert Barnes, William Jerome, and Thomas Garrett, were condemned for heresy under the Act of 6 Articles. Their punishment was the fire. They were chained by the waist and neck to heavy wooden stakes. The Tudor executioners rarely granted a quick death. They utilized damp wood, green branches, and pitch, ensuring the fire would start slowly. This specific method was designed to boil the fat in the legs, slowly scorch the skin, and fill the lungs with toxic carbon monoxide, turning a human being into ash through long minutes of sheer, unadulterated agony. Yet as the executioners prepared the flames, Robert Barnes did something extraordinary. He did not break. He did not weep. He did not surrender to the terror that had broken him 14 years earlier at St. Paul's Cross. Facing the absolute end of his life, Barnes utilized his brilliant, razor-sharp academic mind one final time. He executed a verbal maneuver that completely stripped the Tudor justice system of its remaining legitimacy. Standing chained to the wood, the faggots piled around his waist, Barnes looked down at the massive crowd. He bypassed the executioners and the priests, and he specifically called out the Sheriff of London, William Roche. "Mr. Sheriff," Barnes shouted out clearly over the murmur of the crowd, "is there anyone here to accuse me? What crimes have I committed against the law to deserve this?" The sheriff, a man tasked with enforcing the highest laws in the land, looked up at the condemned man, physically flustered and trapped. In front of thousands of witnesses, the sheriff shook his head and delivered a devastating historical admission. "I have no articles against you," the sheriff replied. "I know nothing." That moment of stunned, helpless silence is the absolute climax of Robert Barnes's life. In those 10 words, the highest law enforcement officer in London admitted the terrifying reality of life under King Henry VIII. There was no justice. There was no law. The state was simply executing a political hit to clean up the emotional and diplomatic wreckage of a deeply insecure king. Barnes used his final breaths to publicly dismantle the illusion of Tudor righteousness. Knowing he had won the moral argument and exposed the state, Barnes displayed incredible political discipline. He strategically separated his Protestant theological convictions from any semblance of secular treason, ensuring the surviving reformist network remained insulated from the crown's wrath following his imminent execution. He even prayed for the success of the king's new marriage to Catherine Howard. He then firmly restated his absolute belief in justification by faith alone. He publicly forgave the men who had put him there, embraced his 2 fellow Protestant martyrs, and folded his hands. The torches were applied to the wood. As the flames rose, catching his clothes and consuming his flesh, witnesses noted a final, chilling detail. Robert Barnes endured the horrific burning without uttering a single scream. When the ashes finally cooled at Smithfield, a chapter of European history closed with them. The execution of Robert Barnes effectively dismantled any remaining prospects for a strategic, religiously moderate alliance between the English crown and the broader German Reformation movement. While the international reaction proved instantaneous as continental academic networks swiftly immortalized his extensive intellectual contributions and ensured his final ideological declarations circulated widely across European borders as an enduring testament to reformist resilience. Ultimately, his fatal navigation of the increasingly volatile intersection between strict ecclesiastical orthodoxy and unyielding monarchical absolutism established a powerful precedent regarding the limits of individual survival within institutional tyranny, unequivocally demonstrating to domestic observers and foreign ambassadors alike that the broader geopolitical security of the realm could be rapidly and ruthlessly sacrificed to accommodate the shifting personal, dynastic, and political priorities of the sovereign.